I've seen proceedings before the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, and when they are in session, they wear a formal garment as well as a wig. That there is a actual specific formal presentation that is appropriate. And insofar as things have been going in the manner they have, I am deferring on the side of caution. I mean, no offense in any way. But my understanding is that there is an effort at international cooperation around considerations of issues that have a multilateral impact. And I also understand that I personally have requested assistance domestically as well as internationally in an understanding that I believe that currently my country, the United States of America, has been infiltrated and that there are people alleging they are qualified to represent themselves as elected members of government when they are not. And that there is more than ample evidence that there have been at least two full election cycles, including two congressional cycles wherein members of the Senate were also involved in election campaigns, as well as a presidential election cycle, where the fraud was so overwhelming that the only thing that would have been conscientious for somebody who was duly elected or believed that they were duly elected to do would be to bring attention to and expose what would otherwise have been potential compromises to their campaign, and if necessary, request the equivalent of a vote of no confidence and or take some other action in order to invalidate the fraudulent election results and to engage a electoral process that was not fraught with fraud. Now, I did not actively investigate it as election fraud in 2016 during the presidential or the congressional sessions at that time because of the situation I was in. But in retrospect, I do believe that I was witness to, as well as subjected to, fraud that necessarily challenged the legitimacy of the 2016 presidential election. However, the manner in which it was addressed was done in bad faith and was not constitutional. And I believe that the 2018 election cycle, as well as the 2020 election cycle, proved that and demonstrated how, if nothing else, what could have been done to mitigate against or prevent against egregious violations of the law in regards to the electoral process were intentionally not performed and obstructed so that the fraud could proliferate and give an appearance of legitimacy to the processes that were ongoing. As such, I believe that this kind of electoral interference was intentionally orchestrated in order to allow for infiltrators to assume the role of office in order to try to coerce the people of the United States to ceding. Now, the matters related to domestic and international distinction very important because peaceful relations with other countries is very necessary for our domestic security. And in light of my attempts to have relationships with people who are from other countries in my life, I could understand how, if a failure or refusal to address corruption internally could lead other countries or people from other countries, including political representatives from other countries, to see the United States as a threat to their national security by virtue of its refusal to deal with its political corruption. This is why I have attempted to maintain my own commitment to do it despite whatever else might be the obstacles, as well as to try to acknowledge when comparable efforts are done internationally, which also means potentially having to identify and address my actions to people that are not currently identified as state actors. It may even potentially be in resistance to, if not in a situation of trying to issue an appropriate challenge to, who would otherwise be allowed to represent themselves publicly and in the international sphere as the state actors of their nation state, and or also attempt to communicate with leadership of areas that have thus far been denied international recognition for or legitimacy in their own national self determination struggles, which I also support. I'm on the record as having said at a specific period of time that I believed that the state of Texas should have seceded from the federal government so that the state of Texas could engage a process of internal fortification, so that if possible, it could also connect with other states within the United States. That it also had discussions around potential secession and or some sort of reconfiguration or even realignment in a part of kind of regional compact. But I've never been a supporter of subversive or coercive processes attempting to intentionally engage acts of sabotage or attempt to politically or economically bankrupt the federal system in order to allow for the pilfering of the public treasury or the political capital of the people to opportunists who have positioned themselves in government agencies or through their affiliations with those positioned in government agencies have attempted to rob national coffers as well as the political goodwill of the people. So this is a very unique situation, but I also have been attempting to have recognition for my rights to due process in my own country after I've been subjected to a number of situations that I believed were attempting to extort me into cooperation with organized crime that had infiltrated the government and had infiltrated other sectors, including sectors that have access to or that provide a form of prevention from acquiring basic resources like housing, like food, like a shower, like medical care that's actually appropriate for the needs and the spiritual or faith traditions of the people involved. As well as, which should and already have been understood to be basic human right, as well as a constitutional right of every person in the United States, which is the right to self sufficiency, the right to be able to provide for yourself and be able to provide for your defense. And the primary means by which to provide for one's defense is to prevent against exploitation that could allow one to be subject to being violated. So, in the course of this, there are a couple of things that have come up. I am on the record, as soon as I found out about it, of having not engaged in processes of decrying the activities that occurred on January 6, 2021, at the United States Capitol building. I had said at the time that I believed that what was occurring, in terms of the manner in which it was responded to by Congress and the Senate, specifically regarding a decision that was made to allow for articles of impeachment to be drawn against Donald Trump, presumably because he incited them to riot, incited the protesters to riot, and then engaged in the actions that occurred on the Capitol grounds. My concern at the time was that if there was actually a successful impeachment of Donald Trump, that this would actually substantiate allegations that had been pending for a considerable amount of time regarding the refusal of people that were elected to public office as representatives of the people to uphold their duties regarding the Constitution, as opposed to currying favor or allowing for the cover of sovereign immunity to put them in a position to co-conspire with crimes, including crimes being orchestrated or that were being set in motion by the executive office. I.e., if the president is engaged in criminal activity, you cannot justify that other people who have not been put through an electoral process and or a confirmation process that is supposed to be presented before the elected representatives of the people should be held to a higher standard than or different standard than people who had been elected and who had to go through a confirmation process before elected representatives of the people of the United States. Now, it was not decided that there was enough support to impeach the Donald Trump. But in the meantime, what also did not happen is that appropriate charges and an appropriate consideration of what actually occurred was not put into effect. I believe the great crime of what happened on January 6th, 2021 was that members of the Senate, as well as the House of Representatives, refused to hold accountable what had the effect of a abdication of the primary position of the leadership of the United States when Vice President and President of the Senate, Mike Pence, refused to acknowledge his authority and duty to address concerns regarding the Electoral College results of the election. His job, specifically as President of the Senate, not just as Vice President, is to be the one to acknowledge the legitimacy and to codify the results of the Electoral College in order to assure that that formal process that is under the actual mandates of the Constitution is applied so as to assure that the transition of power for the office of the presidency is done in a constitutional manner. When he said what he did about lacking the authority to speak on the legitimacy of the Electoral College vote, it was akin to abdicating the ship. It was akin to relinquishing responsibility for the welfare of the United States. And what ended up happening? Well, my contention is that what ended up happening is that in one argument can be made that he actually acknowledged the true authority in that regard. And he did not have it. Who did have it were the people. And the people, as they were present that day, and as they were expressed and asserted, and as they were confirmed, were the people who were already in a public assembly outside in a expression of their rights to assembly and to free speech. And when he abdicated the ship because he did not understand that he was the one with the authority, then the appropriate authority, which was the present representatives of the people of the United States, asserted their authority. And the confirmation of this is that members of the Senate who were present and members of the House of Representatives that were present did not assert their authority by providing an individual or group of individuals that stepped up to the challenge of negotiating with those who were attempting to seize the Capitol grounds. Ergo, it was not a seizure of the Capitol grounds. It was an appropriate expression of the true authority of the people of the United States. Now, if one wants to argue or contend that there is a insinuation that the people of the United States are specifically choreographed to be identified or defined as fitting a particular kind of racial profile or a particular kind of political expression, then this is a matter that would be addressed through ordinary political process, were it not to be intentionally obstructed by infiltrators that are attempting to masquerade as if they are the representatives of the people. It's, again, we're back to the same situation that we were in regards to whether or not the impeachment process was going to be successful. If you contend that the people who expressed the will of the people by assuming command when command had been relinquished by the President of the Senate are somehow not official, verifiable, or legitimate representatives of the people based on whatever the determination is, including a particular kind of political perspective that happened to be present and happened to have a majority expression that day. And that is the sort of thing that needs to be meted out and addressed through ordinary political process. But the entirety of the question that day was that what was supposed to be the expression of ordinary political process in the election situation, in the process of the election, was illegitimate. And so in the course of that, there needed to be an understanding of the crucial matters at hand. And that was one way that I understood that it should have been perceived and it should have been understood. To me, it is disappointing to think that what amounted to an appropriate expression of the will of the people by claiming the Capitol grounds in the midst of what was a hostile takeover by pretenders to political office happened to have a specific kind of composite profile. I'm disappointed there weren't more people of Hispanic descent or Latino descent. I am disappointed there weren't more people that were identified as African American that were a part of it. I'm disappointed that there wasn't a greater diversity of the true representation of the people of the United States. But nonetheless, they are the people of the United States, and it was the people who took command when it was understood that the alleged electoral process was illegitimate. The other way to see it, on the other hand, is that Congress did not appropriately assert its authority when it abandoned ship as well. My understanding is that what ended up happening is once the people came on site, as they did, that members of Senate and the Congress were evacuated from the building. They allowed themselves to be removed from their post. They abandoned the House of the People, and they abandoned us to rioters. Well, that shows a very, very significant and troubling problem with what is allowed to be represented as our political leadership. And unfortunately, like it or not, one of the original charges that was refused consideration by those that identified themselves as qualified for such considerations was that there had been infiltrators into the House of Government that were masquerading as if they were qualified to represent the people of the United States and were not actually performing their constitutional duties. Unfortunately, since January 6th of 2021, the actions that have been taken by those pretenders have proven that point over and over again. Had they actually been involved in a constitutional process, then the appropriate impeachment would not have been of Donald Trump, but would have been of Mike Pence. Nobody took that up. To this day, nobody took that up. And because instead they tried to go through with an impeachment process of Donald Trump and they failed, they have no just cause for holding or charging anybody in accordance with the allegations that were allowed to be levied at the time or since. None of the arrest of those that were alleged to be involved in a riot incited by somebody who, at least at the time, was actually the President of the United States. None of them are of any just cause for being held. There's no just cause for holding any of them or prosecuting any of them. Now, if there is still a consideration, again, about the racialized aspect of the assumption of the power by the people in terms of the actual house, actual seat of government, so to speak, the actual location of the operations of government being assumed by the people in a moment when the person who was charged constitutionally with validating the results of the Electoral College said and affirmed that he did not have the authority, and that was the manner in which the authority was asserted, then again, this is the sort of thing that needs to be addressed through ordinary political process and needs to be able to be addressed in these matters. What it does not need is for illegal arrest and illegal detentions of people that were legitimately expressing the power of the people in a situation when the question of power had been called, when the question of authority had been called in a formal manner, including through the judicial process, including through the legislature, including through the will of the people and public expression of our right to protest, including in all of these manners where the question had been called, the constitutional question had been called, it had been answered. And since then, what we've had is a process of illegal arrests and illegal detentions. And we are in a very precarious situation now because we had just gone through nearly a year-long process where there were public protests of one sort or another in the United States. There was originally protest against the restrictions that were placed on people as part of the COVID-19 requirements, including regarding social distancing and or self-quarantining. And then those protests were supplanted by later protests that were public assemblies attempting to protest against racialized police violence, including fatal racialized police violence. Now, both of those protest movements have a substantial recent history, including during the 2016 election season, by the way. And in the course of that, what happened was certain attention was paid to certain matters that were going on, but there wasn't as much attention paid to considerations of what it means for people involved in ordinary political process or their rights to a freedom of expression, as well as assembly in protest, to engage in or be connected with acts of property destruction, or be put into situations where they were illegally surveilled, including in retaliatory manners, or were themselves subjected to illegal arrest or detention. And the manners in which those needed to be addressed are very comparable to what I believe is an appropriate contextualization of what was going on January 6th. The day before, on January 5th, there were numerous pieces of legislation that had been signed into law by President Donald Trump. Now, technically, regardless of what the decision was concerning the Electoral College vote, Donald Trump was still legally, constitutionally, in office until he transferred the office to the next incoming president. But on January 5th of 2021, there were numerous pieces of legislation that were signed into law, as well as executive orders that were implemented. And what it demonstrated is that routinely and comprehensively throughout the Trump administration, but also after it had also been done through the Obama administration, that pieces of legislation and processes had been invoked by the president that, if nothing else, challenged their constitutional authority for implementation, if not outright flagrantly violated what would otherwise be consideration of the separation of powers or the constitutional roles of the separate branches of government, and were not challenged by Congress. Rather, what ended up happening instead. So there was no question, there was no alarm raised, there was no effort to intercede in. Not only allowing for all of those laws to be signed into, all of those bills to be signed into law the day before January 6th, but also to intercede in and address the fact that many of those laws that were signed in, many of those bills that were signed into law were not constitutional, had constitutional challenges. And as a matter of fact, had been part of a sort of contest of personalities that had taken precedence over and above and beyond the actual constitutional implications of the actions that had been going on concurrently. This is very similar to what was going on, like it or not, with a lot of these protests regarding the violence against people of color. Police violence against people of color that was alleged to be done and committed in a racialized pattern. That concurrent to these fatal events that involved people of color and the police, that there were also major financial deals that had impact on legislative and other processes of the municipalities and areas of concern. At least 3 times there was a fatal police shooting or a fatal police encounter involving somebody who had a very specific name reference in an area where a municipal bond was pending. And in going on a year now, nobody has brought this up as being a very specific and important component to establishing the legitimacy of what would otherwise be understood to be a right to expression of constitutional rights. I believe they're comparable. I believe that there needs to be an analysis of how these other processes that have very significant implications about the economic security of the people of the United States, which includes being safe and secure, being secure in our person and our property, which also includes guarding against illegal search and seizure, especially if it's involved with dispossessing us of our property, so that it can be put into an unconstitutional process, including one that may personally benefit somebody masquerading as if they're a representative of the people. That these are comparable processes. And the matter at hand is to actually understand them on the merits as such, in order to be able to deconstruct the narrativization of this being about race and racial discrimination. There was a particular kind of political capital that the specifics of this paradigm was affording to people who had taken the risk of being on site outside of the Capitol building during the time frame they were, and being able to be there when that occurred, versus other people who had taken the risk of being on site in particular areas to be available when other things occur. These considerations of the political capital distribution and the potential galvanizing effect of the effective implementation and effective use of political capital is the crucial issue here. And that political capital belongs to the people. It belongs to us. And if we're in a situation where we are being defrauded of our own rights, and we are being defrauded of our own capacity to take care of ourselves and defend ourselves, and we are defrauded of even a constitutional process that gives us access to redress, including redress that might attempt to extort us or compel us or sway us into cooperating with something illegal, like a riot, like burning down a police station, like threatening a member of Congress or the public office. These things are illegal. But if we're in a situation where we're being dispossessed of our political capital so that we cannot apply it through a legal constitutional system, because our government has been so infiltrated by criminals that insist on demonstrations of loyalty based upon cooperation with crime at their behest, and then we've got a problem with the legitimacy of our government overall. And this is a symptom of the political corruption that is not exclusively being experienced by any one racial group, and is not exclusively about a contestation with processes of subordination and subjugation that are attempting to dispossess us of our identities. And we're not talking about our identities as the political capital. We're talking about the political capital of the people that should have a diverse representation, and it should have a multicultural as well as multi factor in terms of the way it expresses itself. But what we see here is, despite the appearances of a factional dispute, a consistency of government operationalization of organized crime. And in lieu of an appropriate addressing of what the actual factors are in this consideration, any further detention of, arrest of, or attempt at prosecution of anybody that participated in what is identified as the Capitol riot, but which was actually an assumption of authority by the people of the United States when the question of authority was called, are unconstitutional and lack any sort of legal basis.